The massive steel network that fuels the Russian Federation's war machine is about to be buried in the greatest silence of its history. Russia's largest employer, Russian Railways, RZD, the country's largest commercial army with 700,000 employees, is officially on the verge of bankruptcy. This giant, referred to by the Kremlin as its strategic backbone, is gasping for breath in a debt swamp worth trillions of rubles. And technocrats in Moscow are desperately searching for a formula to clear this massive wreckage. But the real horror lies not in the numbers, but in the approaching social tsunami. 700,000 households and millions of lives dependent on them. All of them are now looking to a decision that the Kremlin will make, or a measure that it will fail to take. RZD, seen as Russia's logistical lifeline, is virtually paralyzed. At the same time, the Russian railways crisis is accompanied by cries of rebellion rising from the AvtoVAZ factories. Instead of stopping this bleeding, Putin is pouring fuel on the fire by imposing an even heavier tax burden on his people. Today we will see clearly how Russia's industrial revolution has turned into an industrial disaster. Our priority will be the crisis facing Russian railways. The collapse of RZD is not simply a cash flow problem. According to data leaked from Kremlin sources and confirmed by Reuters, the company's debt burden reached an unimaginable level of 3.3 trillion rubles in the first half of 2025. However, the pace of the crisis is so rapid that by the second half of the year, this figure is reported to have climbed to 4 trillion rubles, or approximately 38 billion pounds. Consider a state-owned company. Just to service its debt this year, that is, just to pay interest and principal installments, it needs 686 billion rubles, or 7 billion pounds in cash. This money is not in the coffers. This is because the interest rate policy implemented by the Central Bank of Russia to finance the war has pushed RZD's borrowing costs to their highest level in 20 years, to an unsustainable point. So, what is the source of the money, i.e., what is the state of operations? This is where the most concrete evidence from our logistics choke column comes into play. RZD cannot fill its wagons. Freight traffic has been in free fall since the day the invasion of Ukraine began. There was a 3.9% decline in 2022, 0.2% in 2023, 4.1% in 2024, and now a massive 6.7% collapse in the first 9 months of 2025. These figures are not just ordinary statistics, they have become an MRI image of the Russian economy. In particular, the 26.6% drop in grain transportation, the 13.1% drop in construction materials, and the 13.8% drop in cement scream that the civilian economy has come to a standstill. Export routes are closed, domestic demand is dead, and war logistics are pushing civilian transportation off the rails. Company management has launched rescue operations to escape this financial black hole. However, these operations are dragging things into an even worse phase, rather than improving matters. For the first time in 5 years, a net loss was announced for the January-September period. 4.4 billion rubles. Cash reserves paint a complete disaster scenario. They have plummeted from 251.6 billion rubles to 21.7 billion rubles, a 12-fold decrease. When money runs out, the first thing to go is always human capital. RZD President Oleg Belozerov has instructed department heads to optimize, meaning mass layoffs. Hiring has been frozen, and current employees have already begun to be sent on voluntary compulsory unpaid leave. The details of this rescue plan reveal just how much economic trouble the Kremlin is in. Among the options on the table are artificially capping the company's borrowing costs at 9% or converting 400 billion rubles of debt into equity, i.e., worthless shares. This is an attempt to conceal bankruptcy by taking from the state's right pocket and putting it in the left pocket. Finance Minister Anton Silvanov even admitted that they may have to knock on the door of Russia's rainy day fund, the National Welfare Fund, NWF. But remember, half of the NWF has already been spent in the first 3 years of the war. Worse still, RZD was forced to cut its investment program by 40%, from 1.3 trillion rubles to 890 billion rubles. So what does this mean? It means the suspension of strategic projects, such as the Baikal-Amur main line, the shelving of the expansion of the Trans-Siberian line to China, and most importantly, the inability to replace aging locomotives. The cars are empty, the tracks are overloaded, the locomotives are waiting for parts, and the engineers are resigning en masse in the east of the country. As confirmed by the Moscow Times and OSINT sources, military cargo taking precedence over civilian traffic has eliminated the last remaining flexibility in the system. Freight waiting for weeks at stations, rusting rails, and unpaid wages. Russia's logistics giant is collapsing under its own weight. This is interpreted not just as a company's balance sheet, but as the bankruptcy certificate of Putin's war economy. If railways are a country's circulatory system, the automotive industry is its muscle power. And in Russia, the gangrene in the railways has already spread to the highways and factories. The crisis at RZD is not an isolated case. It is part of the wholesale deindustrialization of Russian industry. The ripple effect has reached the doors of AvtoVAZ, the country's largest car manufacturer, and the picture there is even bleaker than that of the railways. Russia's pride, the Lada factories, symbols of the Soviet legacy, have now become centers of silent rebellion and despair. According to reports by the Moscow Times based on local sources, AvtoVAZ workers are resigning en masse due to wage cuts and unbearable working conditions. The salaries of skilled workers, who once dreamed of a middle-class life, have fallen from 100,000 to 120,000 rubles to a laughable 45,000 to 50,000 rubles. The words of a former employee sum up the collapse of the home front in Russia in its purest form. There are no more dreams. It's clear there will be no improvement. Bonuses have been cut, overtime has been canceled, and production lines have been reduced to a 4-day work week. The reason for this collapse is not just internal management errors. It is seen as a crisis created by the war economy. While the military industry vacuums up all the skilled labor, all the raw materials, and all the financial resources in the country, civilian production is condemned to starvation. AvtoVAZ was forced to reduce its 2024 target of 500,000 vehicles to 30,000. Lada sales plummeted by 25% in the January-August period this year. This is because the Russian people's purchasing power has been crushed by inflation and interest rates. The central bank's decision to raise interest rates to stratospheric levels brought car loans to a standstill. In a market where 85% of Lada Vesta sales are credit-based, sales plummeted when credit taps were turned off. The credit volume decreased by 45.5% compared to the previous year. However, this void was not left empty. Strategic partner China is filling every square meter vacated by Russian industry. As of 2024, Chinese brands account for 84.5% of all new cars imported into Russia and have captured 60% of the total market. Russia's domestic production has been reduced to a simple assembly industry using parts from China. Vehicles marketed as domestic, such as the Moskvich 3, are actually just Chinese JAC models with Russian logos slapped on them. While escaping the West's technological embargo, Russia has turned into a technological colony of China. Chinese manufacturers are not interested in setting up factories or transferring technology in Russia. They simply sell finished products and transfer the money to Beijing. The most painful part of this picture is that Russia cannot protect its own citizens. Although the Moscow government increases import duties and recycling fees under the guise of protecting domestic production, this only inflates vehicle prices. The average price of a car has risen by 50% since 2021, reaching 3 million rubles. The average age of vehicles on Russian roads has reached 15.5 years. The Russian people are condemned to drive old, unsafe vehicles. As we have seen so far, RZD's wagons are empty, AvtoVAZ's assembly lines are slow, and workers' pockets are empty. The decline in industrial production created a budget deficit equivalent to 1.7% of GDP in October. Steel demand has collapsed, and coal mining is experiencing its worst period in a decade. This ripple effect is not just an economic downturn, but Russia's loss of its status as a modern industrial society. The Kremlin has sacrificed the country's civilian backbone, its transportation network, and its automotive industry in order to produce tanks and missiles. And now, the price of this sacrifice is about to be paid by 700,000 railway workers and thousands of automotive workers in the form of unemployment. Amidst all this economic turmoil, logistical collapse, and industrial bankruptcy, what was Vladimir Putin's response? To put out the fire or to give the Russian people a breather? Neither. On Friday, November 28th, Putin signed the law that drove the final nail into Russia's economic coffin. The value-added tax was raised from 20% to 22%. This move is not just a tax adjustment. It is a declaration of the Kremlin's strategic desperation in the bigger picture and the economic war it has declared on its own people. Let's analyze. When an economy enters a recession, production declines, and consumer demand collapses, a rational government lowers taxes, provides incentives, and tries to revive the market. But Putin is doing the exact opposite. Because this is not rational economic management, this is a war plunder economy. Falling oil and natural gas revenues due to Western sanctions and massive military expenditures swallowing billions of rubles daily on the Ukrainian front have created an unfillable black hole in the budget. To plug this hole, Putin has chosen to dig deeper into the pockets of already struggling Russian businesses and an impoverished population. This 2% increase may seem small on paper, but combined with the crisis faced by giants like RZD and AvtoVAZ, its impact is devastating. Consider this. RZD, already unable to pay its debts and facing rising costs, will now have to pay more tax for its services or pass this on to freight prices. When freight prices rise, AvtoVAZ, already unable to sell, will see its logistics costs increase. As costs rise, Lada prices will increase. As prices rise, demand will fall even further. This is a self-perpetuating death spiral. Businesses have already stated in surveys that they will pass this tax increase directly on to consumers. In other words, inflation is being fueled by the Kremlin. Even technocrats at the Ministry of Finance admit that this decision will cause inflation to rise. It is likely that even basic necessities such as dairy products and processed foods in Russia will be affected by this tax increase. Putin's move is being described as the failure of the state's promise of protection, as defined in the collapse of the home front. The Russian state no longer appears to be an organism that protects its citizens. By lowering the tax exemption threshold for businesses from 60 million rubles to 10 million rubles, small businesses have also been drawn into the tax net and left to suffocate. This is seen as a project to eliminate Russia's middle class. This is precisely where the strategic checkmate lies for Russia. Putin must kill the economy to continue the war. But when he kills the economy, he also destroys the logistical and industrial base needed to continue the war. RZD's debt, AvtoVAZ's idle production lines, and the 22% VAT are all part of the same equation. This equation does not yield victory. It only yields systemic collapse. You can see the contradiction between the Kremlin's plan to apply to the National Welfare Fund to save RZD and its decision to raise taxes. They are pumping money into the company from one pocket while squeezing the company's customers and employees with taxes from the other. Furthermore, there is also a geopolitical dimension to this situation. As Russia becomes China's economic colony, it is also losing its reflex to protect its own domestic market. A 22% VAT will crush local producers while strengthening the dominance of Chinese importers with their cost advantage. As we saw in the AvtoVAZ example, as Russian industry becomes less competitive, it may become more submissive to Beijing's terms. The warning from economist Oleg Bukhlamishev of Lomonosov Moscow State University rings like a prophecy at this point. Oleg Bukhlamishev said that there may not be a sudden systemic crisis in 2026, but a steady deterioration, a decay in economic conditions, will continue. Russia no longer appears to be a war economy. Giants like RZD seem to be living on life support from the state, but the brain death has already occurred. There is no investment, no innovation, no profitability, only debt, losses, and taxes. The law Putin signed could actually be the death warrant for Russia's economic future. Every ruble spent on the war is a brick stolen from the railways, factories, and people's tables. And now, that wall is crumbling. What are your thoughts on this? We look forward to your comments and likes. Thank you for watching.